let's return to that conflict in Eastern Europe. Quad leaders meeting overnight, as we just heard, split on how to deal with Russia, though. Let's bring in Simon Jackman, Chief Executive of the US Study Centre. Been fascinating to watch two countries in all of this. India trying to sort of quietly condemn, but it needs to get weapons still off Russia. And China, will, for its part, really doing a difficult path here as well. They're not full bottle in supporting Russia, even though they have common enemies, I suppose.
Yeah, two different stories there, but the one I think of most immediate interest for Australia is India with respect to the Quad, Tom. I think, you know, it was a live conversation as soon as the Ukraine contingency erupted last week out at the US Study Centre with my colleagues, and that is, would this break the Quad? Would this, you know, to what extent is the Quad implicated here? And I think keeping it's rather a fragile formation. I think we ought to be frank about that. It had a false start 10, 15 years ago, and where India and Australia to some extent there was some difficulties there. The band's back together now, but it remains very fragile for the reason you elaborated. India's dependence on Russia, and I think a long tradition of independence between great powers, and India charting its own course. The rise of China, of course, is thought to make that's a moment where India has to choose. But I think it's very interesting. Do we go full throttle on this with the Quad as a vehicle for the West's displeasure with what's happening in Russia? I think the balance of thought is, do not push the Quad that hard on a matter that is not about the Indo-Pacific, that is about Eastern Europe.
Right.
So tread carefully, I think, is the balance of opinion among my colleagues out at the US Study Centre with respect to this potentially very valuable formation for Australia, but still very fragile and very much in its early days.
I think that's a really interesting point. It's something's that fragile, you don't push it, I suppose. Really interested in your thoughts as well. I know we had the talk of nuclear action from Russia. I'm not trying to alarm people unnecessarily here. The language was about putting the nuclear forces on high alert. People were pointing out in the sort of doctrine set out within Russian military, that doesn't actually mean anything. But we know when Russia would be allowed to use its nuclear weapons according to its own principles, if you like, if they're directly threatened or their allies are by either weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons. That's clearly not happening here. Is there a genuine concern that Putin could go rogue if that were his mindset, or are there checks and balances here within the Russian system?
I'm not an expert on Russia, Tom, but friends of mine are. And I keep coming back to remarks by my former colleague at Stanford, Mike McFaul, who was in the National Security Council doing Russia policy for Obama before he became Obama's ambassador to Russia. Mike said something the other day that was chilling to me. Yes, there's a lot of posturing about the escalating the nuclear standby, the preparedness, readiness of Russia's nuclear forces. Mike said that people that he knows that are close to Putin are the most worried, whereas the people that are most relaxed about this are people that don't know Putin. And that, for me, was just watch this space. And of course, Tom, right now we've got another crisis unfolding in real time. That is that nuclear plant that's been shelled and is on fire. Perhaps a different sort of nuclear threat to the one you asked me about. But I think I'm probably more focused on that in the very immediate term than the prospect of Putin going.
Well, in 30 seconds, what do we know about that? I mean, surely Russia knows what they're doing here. Well, this can't have been an accident.
I think it's everything about this operation suggests a lot of logistical hang-ups, a lot of disrupted communications, poor command and control. And perhaps shelling it, you'd like to think it was a mistake. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's, but the most likely thing about battlefields is probably it's a stuff-up, but potentially an incredibly grave one, Tom. And if you, by the way, though, if you wanted to bog down Ukrainian civil defence and emergency services, you've just done it, right? Their attention is going to be there. So who knows? It could well have been deliberate.
troubling either way, I suppose. I do apologise, we're very short on time today, Simon, but I'm sure we'll talk longer next week. There's a bit on
No
today.
worries.
Thank you.